I still remember the exact moment they stepped onto my land because everything about it felt so absurd that my brain almost refused to believe it was happening. 3 people wearing matching polo shirts climbed out of a white SUV with clipboards in their hands, acting like they owned every square foot around my house. And instead of telling them to get off my property, I simply watched. The funny part is, I already knew they were making the biggest mistake of their lives. They just hadn't figured it out yet. My name is Ethan Brooks, and until all this happened, I honestly believed the easiest way to avoid drama was to keep to myself. I bought my place just outside Cedar Ridge, Tennessee, because I wanted space, quiet mornings, and enough land so I could drink coffee on my porch without hearing somebody else's lawnmower 5 feet away. My grandfather used to tell me that land wasn't just dirt, it was peace of mind. And after spending almost 15 years working commercial construction all over the Southeast, living out of motel rooms and chasing contracts, I finally understood exactly what he meant. The property wasn't fancy. There wasn't a mansion sitting on top of the hill or a gated entrance with stone pillars. It was just a comfortable ranch house surrounded by open grass, old oak trees, and a few acres that gently rolled toward a newer subdivision built several years after I'd already purchased the land. That subdivision had a homeowners association. I didn't, never had, never planned to. When the development first went up, I figured we'd simply be neighbors separated by an invisible property line, and everyone would go about their own business. For almost 3 years, that's exactly how things worked. I'd wave if I saw someone walking their dog. A couple of families even bought fresh tomatoes from the little garden my wife Emily kept every summer. Kids occasionally rode bikes near the edge of my pasture, and if a ball rolled onto my side, I'd toss it back with a smile. Everything felt normal. Then things slowly started changing after a new HOA president was elected. Her name wasn't Karen, despite how everyone online loves using that name. This woman's name was Diane Mercer, and from everything I heard, she genuinely believed rules solved every problem in the world. If somebody painted their mailbox the wrong shade of black, she'd notice. If a trash can stayed outside an extra hour after pickup, she'd know before dinner. At first, none of that mattered because, well, I wasn't part of their neighborhood, or so I thought. One Monday afternoon, I came home from picking up supplies in town and found an envelope taped directly to my front door. No stamp, no mailbox, just blue painter's tape holding it there like someone wanted to make sure I couldn't possibly miss it. Across the front were the words "Final Compliance Notice." I actually laughed before opening it because I assumed somebody had delivered it to the wrong address. Inside were 3 pages listing violations. My grass exceeded acceptable height. An equipment shed hadn't been approved. A section of fencing supposedly violated community design standards. The letter ended by saying I had 72 hours to correct every violation or daily fines would begin immediately. I read every word twice, then looked across the open field toward the subdivision entrance where their decorative stone sign sat proudly beside the road. Then I looked back at my own yard and couldn't help smiling. They had the wrong property. Completely wrong. Emily walked out carrying 2 glasses of iced tea and found me standing there staring at the letter. She asked, "Everything okay?" I handed it to her without saying anything. She made it halfway through the first page before looking up with that confused expression I've learned usually means somebody else has done something incredibly stupid. "Do they know this isn't their neighborhood?" she asked. "Apparently not," I answered. She laughed. I laughed. We both assumed that would be the end of it. Surely someone would check county records before trying to find a homeowner who didn't even belong to the association. I tossed the notice into a kitchen drawer with old appliance manuals and warranty cards, figuring eventually someone would realize the mistake. Instead, the next morning around 9, I heard tires crunching across my gravel driveway. Through the front window, I saw that same white SUV rolling toward the house. 3 people stepped out carrying measuring wheels, cameras, and clipboards, talking confidently as they walked straight across my yard without knocking, without asking permission, without even looking toward the porch where I was standing. They spread out across the property like surveyors preparing for an inspection, pointing at my shed, measuring sections of fence, taking photographs, writing notes, and discussing violations loud enough that I could hear every word. One of them even planted a little orange marking flag beside my fence post, as if they'd already decided what I was required to remove. Every instinct told me to walk out there and order them off my land, but something stopped me. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was amusement. Or maybe it was the simple realization that sometimes the fastest way to expose someone isn't by interrupting them. It's by giving them just enough rope to keep proving themselves wrong. So I leaned against the porch railing, folded my arms, took another sip of coffee, and watched the entire performance unfold, already knowing tomorrow was going to be far more interesting than today. The next morning turned into exactly what I expected, only somehow even stranger. Around 8:30, I heard that same SUV before I saw it, tires crunching slowly over my gravel like the people inside believed they had official business to conduct. This time, I didn't bother stepping outside right away. I stayed in the kitchen, poured another cup of coffee, and watched through the window as Diane Mercer climbed out wearing sunglasses, a bright blue blazer despite the July heat, and the kind of expression that said she'd already decided how the conversation was going to end. Behind her were the same two volunteers from the previous day, both carrying thick folders now instead of simple clipboards, which honestly made me smile because they'd apparently spent the evening building a case against someone they had never bothered to verify belonged under their authority. I finally opened the front door when Diane reached the porch. She didn't introduce herself, didn't say good morning. She simply held out a stack of papers. "Mr. Brooks," she said confidently, "after yesterday's inspection, we've documented multiple violations of the Cedar Ridge Estates covenanters. You'll need to begin corrective action immediately." I looked at the papers but made no effort to take them. "Morning to you too," I replied. She sighed the way teachers do with children they think aren't listening. "This doesn't have to become difficult." I couldn't help chuckling. "I don't think it does either." Her expression tightened. "Your fence exceeds community standards. Your storage building wasn't approved. Portions of your grass violate maintenance regulations. And according to our measurements, your property improvements extend into common preservation areas." That last sentence almost made me laugh out loud because the so-called preservation area she was referring to had been part of my deed since long before a single foundation was poured for her subdivision. I asked one simple question. "Before you measured everything yesterday, did anyone check the county parcel maps?" She answered almost instantly. "We have our own development maps." I nodded slowly. "That's not what I asked." There was a brief pause before she crossed her arms. "Our architectural committee has already reviewed the situation." Still not what I asked. One of the volunteers shifted awkwardly behind her. I noticed him glance toward the open pasture like he suddenly wasn't quite as confident anymore. Diane, however, doubled down. "Mr. Brooks, if you're refusing to cooperate, daily fines will begin Friday morning." She actually sounded proud saying it, like she'd practiced that sentence in front of a mirror. I stood there quietly for another second before saying, "Hang on." Then I stepped back inside. Emily looked up from the dining room table where she'd been answering work emails. "Is this the dramatic part?" she whispered with a grin. "Not yet," I answered. "This is just intermission." I walked into my home office, unlocked a small fireproof cabinet, and pulled out a blue folder that hadn't been touched in years. Inside were copies of our survey, the updated legal description, county approval records, GIS maps, and the boundary adjustment that had been finalized almost 8 years earlier after my elderly neighbor sold part of his acreage. It wasn't exciting paperwork. Honestly, it was painfully boring. But boring paperwork has an incredible habit of ending exciting arguments. When I walked back outside, Diane was already speaking to one of her volunteers about scheduling another inspection later that week. She stopped talking when she saw the folder in my hand. I held out one document. "Before we go any further," I said calmly, "I'd appreciate it if you'd read this." She accepted it with the same confidence she'd shown all morning. At first, nothing changed. Her eyes moved steadily across the page. She flipped it over. "Read another paragraph." Then her eyebrows narrowed slightly. She looked back at the first page, then at the attached survey, then back again. I watched the exact moment uncertainty replaced certainty. It's a subtle thing. People rarely admit they're wrong immediately. First comes silence, then confusion. Then they begin searching desperately for an explanation that still allows them to save face. Diane traced one finger across the survey map. "This boundary adjustment," she murmured. "Correct," I answered. She turned another page. "Recorded with the county?" "Yes." "Approved 8 years ago." Another pause. She looked toward my pasture, then toward the subdivision entrance, then back to the survey. "Our maps don't show this." "That's because your maps were never updated." One volunteer quietly stepped closer and looked over her shoulder. His expression changed almost immediately. "Diane," he said softly. She ignored him. Instead, she pulled out her own neighborhood map and spread it across the hood of the SUV. For nearly 2 minutes, nobody said a word. They compared lines, measurements, lot numbers, easements. Then she pulled out her phone. I couldn't hear the entire conversation, but I caught enough. Can you pull parcel? Pause. No. County records. Another pause. What do you mean superseded? Longer silence. You're telling me this was amended before phase 2? She slowly lowered the phone. Nobody moved. Even the birds seemed quieter somehow. Finally, she looked directly at me. So, this entire section. She pointed toward the area they'd spent nearly an hour measuring the previous day. It's yours, always has been. Another long silence. One of the volunteers quietly pulled the orange survey flags out of the ground without being asked. The other lowered his camera. Diane stared across the field again, as if the land itself had somehow betrayed her. We genuinely believed, she began. I finished the sentence for her. I know exactly what you believed. Our committee said. Your committee never checked. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. The confidence she'd arrived with was completely gone now. But what surprised me most wasn't that she'd been wrong. People make mistakes every day. What bothered me was how comfortable they'd been exercising authority before confirming they actually had any. That's a dangerous habit, whether you're running an HOA, a corporation, or a government office. Emily stepped onto the porch carrying a fresh pitcher of lemonade, looked at the awkward little gathering in the driveway, and innocently asked, "Everything getting sorted out?" I smiled. "Looks like we're finally looking at the right map." One volunteer actually laughed under his breath. Diane didn't. She stood there for another few seconds before handing my survey back with noticeably slower movements than before. "We'll review this internally. I'd recommend reviewing your entire property database," I replied. "You may not be looking at the only mistake." That landed harder than I intended because I saw genuine concern flash across her face. If one parcel had been wrong for years, how many others had never been verified? The possibility seemed to hit everyone at once. They packed up their folders much more quietly than they'd unpacked them. No more confident voices, no more measurements, no more threats. Just the sound of truck doors closing and gravel crunching as they drove away. Emily watched until the SUV disappeared around the curve. "Think that's over?" she asked. I looked down at the blue folder still resting in my hands. Something told me this wasn't the ending. It felt more like the first domino had just tipped over, and whatever happened next was probably going to make that awkward driveway conversation look like the easy part. Over the next 2 weeks, I learned something that had nothing to do with fences or property lines and everything to do with human nature. People don't usually get themselves into real trouble because they make one mistake. They get into trouble because their pride won't let them admit the first one. 2 days after Diane's visit, I received an email from the HOA's attorney requesting copies of the survey and county filings. The tone was noticeably different from the violation letters. There were no threats, no deadlines, no bold words demanding compliance. Just a polite request followed by an apology for the inconvenience. I sent everything over that afternoon. About a week later, one of the homeowners from the subdivision knocked on my door carrying a pie his wife had baked. His name was Mark, and after introducing himself, he scratched the back of his neck and said, "You probably don't know this, but everyone's talking about what happened." I laughed. "I'm guessing that's not because of my lawn," he smiled. "Not exactly. Turns out your survey made the board start checking all their old records." We sat on the porch for almost an hour while he explained that several easements, lot dimensions, and maintenance responsibilities had been copied from outdated development maps years earlier. Most of the errors were minor, but they had never been corrected because nobody had ever questioned them. Apparently, my property was simply the first one where the mistake became impossible to ignore. A month later, the HOA held a community meeting, even though I wasn't a member. Diane personally invited me to attend. That surprised me more than anything else. I almost declined, but Emily convinced me to go. "People usually remember the person who embarrassed them," she said. "Sometimes they also remember the person who gave them a chance to fix it." The meeting wasn't dramatic. There were no shouting matches, no television-style confrontations, no one getting escorted out. Instead, Diane stood in front of nearly 100 homeowners and admitted that the board had relied on outdated information, that enforcement procedures would immediately change, and that future property disputes would require verified county records before any notices were issued. I won't pretend it was easy for her. Owning a mistake publicly rarely is. Afterwards, she walked over and quietly said, "Mr. Brooks, Ethan, I owe you an apology." I nodded. "Thank you." She hesitated before adding, "I was so convinced we were protecting the neighborhood that I never considered we might be protecting the wrong information." That sentence stayed with me. Because honestly, I could have handled the whole thing differently too. I could have stormed outside that first morning, screamed at everyone to get off my property, threatened lawsuits, recorded videos for the internet, and turned the whole situation into a circus. Maybe it would have felt satisfying for a few minutes, but none of that would have changed the facts. The survey would still have been the survey. The county records would still have existed. Truth doesn't become stronger because you yell louder. It just waits patiently until someone finally looks at it. These days, when I sit on my porch with a cup of coffee, I still see neighbors walking dogs along the edge of the subdivision. Kids still wave when they ride by on their bikes. Mark still stops every now and then to complain about football or the weather. Life looks almost exactly the way it did before all of this happened, except now everyone seems just a little more willing to ask questions before making assumptions. And every once in a while, I'll catch someone glancing toward the old property line before smiling at me, almost like they're remembering the story that spread through the neighborhood about the HOA that accidentally tried to find the wrong landowner. Looking back, I don't think this was really a story about an HOA at all. It was a story about what happens when confidence replaces curiosity, when authority moves faster than facts, and when people become so certain they're right that they stop checking whether they actually are. I'd love to tell you every disagreement ends this peacefully, but we all know that's not true. Sometimes people double down. Sometimes relationships never recover. Sometimes one bad decision turns into 10 because nobody wants to admit the first one. So now I'm curious what you think. If you had been standing on that porch, watching strangers walk across your property with clipboards and cameras, would you have stopped them immediately? Or would you have done exactly what I did and quietly let the truth reveal itself when the time was right? Let me know down in the comments because I honestly think there are good arguments on both sides. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more real-world property and neighborhood conflicts, and share this with someone who believes every dispute has to end with shouting. Sometimes the strongest move isn't winning the argument. It's calmly holding the right piece of paper while everyone else slowly realizes they were arguing with the facts.